1 year had passed since the tribunal, and the galaxy had changed in ways that no one could have predicted. Vanya stood on the balcony of a modest home on the human colony world of New Bizin, watching the sun sink toward the horizon in shades of orange and gold that reminded her of the apple Ji-hoon had shared with her so long ago. The planet was beautiful in a wild and untamed way. All rolling hills and dense forests and rivers that sparkled like ribbons of silver under the clear sky. It was nothing like the sterile corridors of the station where she had spent most of her life. And sometimes she still had to remind herself that this was real and not some elaborate dream behind her. The door opened and closed, and she felt Ji-hoon's presence before his hand came to rest gently on her shoulder. She leaned into his touch without flinching, and that simple act of trust still amazed her every time she managed it. "The transport arrived today," he said. 47 new refugees, including 12 children who have never known anything but slavery. Vanya nodded and felt the familiar mixture of sorrow and determination that came with each new group. The Seong precedent, as the galactic news networks had started calling it, had spread further than either of them had imagined possible. Other humans had begun using the same legal tactic to free enslaved individuals throughout hegemony space. And while the Vorthani government had tried everything to close the loophole, they had discovered that changing ancient law was far more difficult than ignoring it. Each marriage was a battle fought in courtrooms and diplomatic chambers, and not all of them succeeded. But enough did to create a steady stream of freed individuals seeking asylum in human space. Vanya had found her purpose in helping those refugees adjust to their new lives, teaching them the things she had struggled so hard to learn about: freedom and choice, and the terrifying responsibility of deciding one's own fate. The work was exhausting and emotionally draining, but it filled a hole in her heart that she had not even known existed. "The Resistance sent another message," Ji-hoon added. "They say the uprising on Alari Prime is gaining strength, and the hegemony has had to pull military forces from 3 other systems to try to contain it." Vanya turned to face him, and she saw the same cautious hope in his eyes that she felt in her own heart. The Resistance had grown bolder in the months since her testimony, using her story as a rallying cry that echoed across every world where the Alari lived in chains. They were still fighting against overwhelming odds, still losing more battles than they won. But for the first time in generations, they were truly fighting rather than simply enduring. "Mitha wants me to record a message of support," Vanya said, "to be broadcast on the anniversary of my freedom. What will you say?" Ji-hoon asked. She thought about the question carefully, as she had learned to do with all questions that mattered. "I will tell them the truth," she finally said. "That freedom is not given, but taken. That healing is slow and painful and worth every moment of struggle. And that even the mightiest empires can be brought down by people who refuse to accept that chains are their natural state." Ji-hoon smiled, and she still found his smile remarkable in its warmth and openness. "You have come so far," he said softly. "From the woman who knelt on my floor and could not meet my eyes. You gave me the chance to come this far," Vanya replied. "And I will never forget that, even if we spend the rest of our lives together, and I tell you 1,000 times." The words hung in the air between them, heavier than they might have been a year ago, when their marriage was purely a legal fiction somewhere along the way. Between the tribunal and the journey to New Bizin, and the long nights spent talking about everything and nothing, something had changed. What began as a partnership of necessity had grown into something deeper, something neither of them had expected or planned for. Ji-hoon's hand moved from her shoulder to cup her cheek, and Vanya leaned into his palm with a trust she had never thought herself capable of giving. "I did not marry you for love," he said quietly, "but I find that love has come anyway. Like a flower growing in soil, I did not know I had prepared." Vanya felt tears prick at her eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow or fear. "I did not know what love was," she admitted. And perhaps I still do not understand it fully. But I know that when I think of the future, I want you in it. And that seems like a good place to start. He kissed her forehead gently, and she closed her eyes and simply breathed in the moment. Below the balcony, the small Ilari community that had formed around them was preparing for evening meal. And the sound of voices and laughter drifted up through the cooling air. Children who had been born into slavery ran and played on grass they had never seen before arriving on this world. And their joy was the most beautiful sound Venya had ever heard. "Humans are strange," she said after a while, repeating words she had spoken once before. "You see chains and immediately want to break them." Ji-hoon laughed softly, his chest warm against her back. "That is perhaps the most human thing about us," he agreed. "We look at the impossible and we say, why not? And we look at injustice and we say, not here. And sometimes we are foolish and sometimes we fail. But we never stop trying." Venya turned in his arms to face him fully, and she saw in his eyes the same determination that had driven him to challenge an empire for the sake of a slave he did not know. "Then I am glad I met a human," she said. "And I am glad that human was you." The sun completed its journey below the horizon, and the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. And somewhere out among those distant lights, an empire built on chains was finally beginning to crack. The story of the human who had turned a gift into a bride and a possession, into a person had spread to every corner of known space, carried by whispers and broadcasts and the simple stubborn hope of those who had been told they were worth nothing. It was not the end of anything, because freedom was not a destination, but a journey that each generation had to walk for themselves. But it was a beginning. And sometimes beginnings were all that was needed to change everything. Vanya looked up at the stars and thought about all the others still waiting in darkness for someone to see them as people rather than property. "There is still so much work to do," she said. "Then we should get started," Ji-hoon replied. And he took her hand in his own. Together, they walked back inside to prepare for tomorrow, carrying with them the knowledge that every empire eventually falls and every chain eventually breaks. All it takes is one person willing to say no more, and then another, and then another after that, until the voices of the free become louder than the silence of the enslaved. Then the galaxy finally remembers what it means to be human. The weeks following the ceremony brought changes that Venya had never imagined possible. And with those changes came challenges she had never been prepared to face. News of what Ji-hoon had done spread across the station like fire through dry grass. And within days, it had reached the communication networks that connected the hegemony to the wider galaxy. Some called him a troublemaker and a threat to galactic stability, while others whispered that humanity might be exactly what the galaxy needed. And the debates raged in diplomatic chambers and trading posts from one end of known space to the other. Venya found herself at the center of attention she had never wanted, and the pressure of it pressed against her like a physical weight. Ji-hoon shielded her as much as he could, handling the interviews and the official inquiries and the endless stream of visitors who wanted to see the slave who had become a citizen. But he could not shield her from herself. And that was where the real struggle lay. She had been property for her entire existence, and the habits of slavery did not disappear simply because a law had changed. She still flinched when voices grew loud, still waited for permission before eating or sitting or speaking, still felt panic rise in her chest whenever Ji-hoon left the room and she was alone at night. She dreamed of the collar closing around her throat again, of hands dragging her back to the pens where slaves were kept like animals. And she would wake gasping and trembling in the darkness. Ji-hoon never complained about being woken by her nightmares, and he never touched her without warning. But he would sit nearby and speak softly until her breathing calmed and she could remember where she was. "It takes time," he told her one morning when she apologized for her weakness. And healing is not a straight line but a winding path with many setbacks. And the fact that you are struggling does not mean you are failing. She wanted to believe him. But believing was hard when every instinct screamed at her that freedom was temporary and punishment was surely coming. The message from the Ilari underground reached them through a servant who passed Venya, a tiny data chip hidden in a food delivery. And she nearly dropped it when she realized what she held. "They want to meet with me," she told Ji-hoon after reading the encrypted contents. "The resistance movement that has been fighting the hegemony for generations. They say I have become a symbol to them." Ji-hoon studied the message carefully. His expression thoughtful. "What do you want to do?" he asked. The question stopped her cold, because she still was not accustomed to being asked what she wanted. And the weight of choosing her own path felt terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. "I want to meet them," she finally said. "I want to know that what happened to me means something beyond just my own freedom." The meeting took place in a maintenance corridor deep within the station where security patrols rarely ventured. And Ji-hoon insisted on accompanying her, even though the resistance had asked her to come. Alone, 3 Ilari emerged from the shadows, their violet skin marked with the scars of hard lives and their eyes burning with fierce determination. Their leader introduced herself as Councilor Mitha, and she had once been a slave herself before escaping into the underground network that stretched across hegemony space. "You do not know what you have done," Mitha said to Venya, "but we do. And we have been waiting centuries for someone to find a crack in the legal wall that keeps our people in chains." She explained that the resistance had always known about the ancient law Ji-hoon had used, but they had never been able to exploit it because no one with legal standing had been willing to marry an Ilari slave. "Your human has changed everything," Mitha continued with a glance at Ji-hoon that held both gratitude and calculation. "Because now we have precedent, and now we have proof that the system can be turned against itself." Venya felt the responsibility settling onto her shoulders like a cloak woven from hope and fear. "What would you have me do?" she asked. "Tell your story." Mitha replied simply, "To everyone who will listen. And let them see that freedom is possible, even for those who have been told they were born to serve." The request from the Galactic Tribunal came 3 weeks later, and Venya understood that the hegemony had not given up. They demanded that she appear before a panel of judges to answer questions about her marriage. And the underlying accusation was clear enough that even the diplomatic language could not hide it. They believed Ji-hoon had coerced her, had forced her into the marriage through manipulation or threats. And they wanted her to confirm that suspicion so they could declare the bond invalid. "You do not have to do this," Ji-hoon told her the night before the hearing. "We can refuse, we can claim diplomatic immunity, we can find another way." But Venya shook her head, and she was surprised to find that the fear which had defined her entire life was finally beginning to fade. "I need to do this," she said. "Not for the law and not for the resistance, but for myself. Because I need to stand up and declare my own truth to those who think I have no right to speak." The tribunal chamber was even larger than the High Court of Commerce, filled with representatives from every major power in the region who had gathered to witness what many expected to be humanity's humiliation. Via walked to the witness platform with her head held high, and she felt Ji-hoon's presence behind her like a warm wind at her back. The chief adjudicator, a Vorthani elder with graying scales, asked the question that everyone had come to hear. "Were you coerced into this marriage bond?" he demanded. "Did the human threaten you, or deceive you, or force you in any way to speak vows you did not mean?" Venya looked out at the assembled witnesses, at the Vorthani who had profited from her suffering, and the other species who had looked away and pretended not to see. Then she looked at Ji-hoon, who watched her with quiet confidence and absolutely no doubt in his eyes. "I was born into chains," she said, and her voice carried clearly through the silent chamber. And for my entire life before I met this human, I was never once asked what I wanted, or what I felt, or what I believed. She straightened her spine and felt the ring on her finger. Warm and solid and real, Commander Seong Ji-hoon did not coerce me, she continued. He did not threaten me or manipulate me or force me to do anything. And in fact, he gave me something I had never received from anyone in the hegemony. The adjudicator leaned forward with narrowed eyes. And what was that? He asked. Venya smiled. And the expression felt strange on her face, but also right. A choice, she said. He gave me a choice. And for the first time in my existence, I was treated as a person capable of deciding my own fate. She looked directly at the Vorthani delegation, and she did not flinch from their hostile stares. I chose him, she declared. I chose freedom, and I would choose it again 1,000 times over. And no law or tribunal or empire will ever make me say otherwise. The chamber erupted into chaos. Voices shouting over each other in a dozen different languages. But Venya stood calm at the center of the storm. She had spoken her truth, and no one could ever take that away from her. The High Court of Commerce occupied the central spire of the station, a vast chamber designed to intimidate anyone who entered with its towering pillars and its ceiling that seemed to stretch into infinity. Ji-hoon walked through the massive doors with Venya at his side. Not behind him where a slave would walk, but beside him, where an equal would stand. He had spent 2 days preparing for this moment, rehearsing arguments and studying precedents and making sure every document was in perfect order. The Vorthani did not make exceptions for ignorance or error, and a single mistake could destroy everything. High Merchant Torvax sat upon a raised platform at the far end of the chamber, surrounded by legal scholars and lesser merchants who had gathered to witness. Whatever spectacle was about to unfold, word had spread that the human diplomat had requested a formal audience, and curiosity had drawn representatives from a dozen different species jinn, recognized ambassadors from the Kalori Federation and the Scythian Collective, along with several other powers he had only read about in briefings. They were all watching, all waiting to see what humanity would do. You stand before the High Court of Commerce, Torvax announced in a voice that echoed through the chamber. State your business and be recognized. Ji-hoon stepped forward and performed the formal bow required by protocol. Deep enough to show respect, but not so deep as to suggest submission. I come before this court to register a marriage bond, he declared, between myself and the woman known as Venya of the Alari, in accordance with the laws of both humanity and the hegemony. The silence that followed was absolute, and Ji-hoon could feel the shock rippling through the assembled witnesses, like waves spreading from a stone dropped in still water. Then Torvax began to laugh, a harsh clicking sound that held no humor. You mock this court, the High Merchant said, and you mock the hegemony itself with this absurd request. For how can one marry property? And how can a slave enter into any legal contract with respect? Ji-hoon replied calmly. I do not mock anyone, and I cite the precedent of Vorthax III, established in the 407th year of the hegemony, which states that a bonded companion cannot be classified as property, regardless of their previous status. He produced a data tablet and transmitted the relevant documents to the court's display system, and the ancient legal text appeared in glowing letters above the assembly. The law is clear, Ji-hoon continued, that a marriage bond recognized by both parties, customs and properly witnessed, transfers full legal personhood to all participants. And there is no clause that excludes any species or any previous condition of servitude. Torvax's clicking laughter had died away, replaced by an expression that Ji-hoon could only interpret as fury. That law was written for Voltani nobility, the High Merchant snarled, not for primitive newcomers who do not understand our ways. The law makes no mention of species requirements, Ji-hoon countered. And unless this court wishes to declare the humans are not recognized as legal persons under hegemony law, which would invalidate our entire trade agreement. Then the precedent must apply equally to all. He could see the legal scholars conferring frantically, their forearms waving in agitated patterns as they searched for some loophole or exception that could block his argument. But Ji-hoon had spent days studying their system, and he knew they would find nothing. "The human speaks correctly," one of the elder scholars finally admitted, his voice heavy with reluctance. "The precedent of Vorthax contains no species limitations, and it has never been formally modified or repealed." Torvax turned his glare upon the scholar as though contemplating violence, then returned his attention to Ji-hoon. "Even if the law permits this farce," the high merchant said coldly, "you must prove that your marriage customs are legitimate and that this bond meets all requirements for recognition." Ji-hoon had prepared for this challenge, and he gestured for Venya to join him at the center of the chamber. "Human marriage customs require the exchange of vows," he explained, "spoken promises that bind the participants to each other, along with the exchange of rings as physical symbols of the bond, all witnessed by others who can attest to the validity of the ceremony." He turned to face Venya, and for a moment the vast chamber seemed to fade away until only the two of them remained. "Do you, Venya of the Alari, choose freely to enter into this bond with me?" he asked, "knowing that it will change your legal status and grant you all the rights and protections of a citizen of Earth." Venya's voice trembled when she spoke, but her words were clear. "I choose freely," she said, "and I enter this bond of my own will." A murmur ran through the assembled witnesses, and Ji-hoon saw several of the Alari servants around the edges of the chamber staring at Venya with expressions of desperate longing. "Do you promise to stand beside me as an equal partner?" Ji-hoon continued, "To share both burdens and blessings as we build a life together." "I promise," Venya replied. And this time, her voice was stronger. Ji-hoon produced two simple rings crafted from earth metals. Nothing elaborate or expensive, but symbols nonetheless of what this moment represented. "With this ring, I take you as my partner," he said as he slipped a smaller band onto her finger. "And I pledge to protect your freedom for as long as I draw breath." Venya took the other ring with hands that shook slightly, and she looked at Ji-hoon with wonder in her large, dark eyes. "With this ring, I take you as my partner," she repeated, "and I pledge to honor the gift you have given me." The ring slid onto his finger, warm from her touch, and Ji-hoon felt the weight of it like a promise made solid. "The witnesses have seen," he announced, turning back to face the court. "The vows have been spoken. The rings have been exchanged, and by both human custom and hegemony law, this marriage is complete." Torvax rose from his seat, all four arms clenched into fists, and his voice was cold with barely contained rage. "You think you have won something here today," the high merchant said, "but you have only made enemies. And the hegemony does not forget those who make us look foolish. I have broken no laws," Ji-hoon replied steadily, "and I have harmed no one. And if the hegemony feels foolish, it is perhaps because your own legal system has been used to reveal an injustice you would prefer remain hidden." He took Venya's hand in his own and faced the chamber full of witnesses. "Let the record show," he said clearly, "that Venya is no longer property but a person, no longer a slave but a citizen, no longer alone but part of something greater." Venya squeezed his hand, and when Ji-hoon looked at her, he saw tears streaming down her violet cheeks, but she was smiling, truly smiling. "Perhaps for the first time in her life, partners," she whispered. "Partners." He agreed, and together they walked out of the High Court of Commerce, leaving behind a chamber full of stunned silence and the first cracks forming in an empire built on chains. 3 days passed in the small diplomatic quarters, and Venya found herself caught in a strange new world that operated by rules she did not understand. Human called Ji-hoon spent most of his waking hours at a computer terminal, reading documents in languages she could not decipher and taking notes in a script that looked like scattered lines and circles. He asked her questions sometimes, gentle questions about hegemony law and customs. And he always thanked her when she answered, as though her knowledge actually held value. No one had ever thanked her for anything in her entire existence. She watched him carefully during those days, waiting for the mask to slip and reveal the monster underneath, because she had learned long ago that kindness was always a trap designed to lower her guard before the cruelty began. But the mask never slipped. He gave her the bed each night and slept on the small couch that was clearly too short for his frame. And in the morning she would find him already awake with dark circles under his eyes and a cup of something hot and bitter in his hands. He offered her food before taking any for himself and asked her which dishes she preferred rather than simply assigning her whatever scraps remained on the second day. He noticed her staring at a piece of fruit she had never seen before, something round and red that came from the human homeworld, and he cut it into slices and offered her the first piece with a small smile. It was sweet and crisp and tasted like nothing she had ever experienced, and she had to blink rapidly to keep the moisture from spilling down her cheeks. It is called an apple, Ji-hoon told her, and it grows on trees back on Earth, and my grandmother had an orchard full of them when I was young. He spoke of his homeworld sometimes, painting pictures with words of blue skies and green forests and oceans that stretched beyond the horizon. And Venya found herself listening with an intensity that surprised her. She had never been permitted to ask questions of her masters, but Ji-hoon seemed to welcome them. And slowly she began to learn about the strange species that had claimed our humans lived short lives compared to most galactic races, barely a century if they were fortunate. And yet they burned with a fierce energy that drove them to accomplish impossible things in their limited time. They had fought wars among themselves over the concept of freedom, had spilled oceans of their own blood to establish the principle that no person could own another. And they carried that conviction with them into the stars. I think I have found something, Ji-hoon announced on the morning of the fourth day. And there was a light in his eyes that Venya had not seen before. She knelt beside his chair because old habits were difficult to break, and he frowned at her position but did not comment on it. There is an ancient law in the hegemony legal code, he explained, turning the screen so she could see the dense text displayed there. From back when the Vorthani first conquered other species and needed to integrate their nobility into the existing power structure, Venya recognized some of the formal legal language. Though much of it was archaic and unfamiliar, the law states that a bonded companion cannot be classified as property, Ji-hoon continued, because the Vorthani nobles of that era wanted to be able to elevate their favorite slaves to positions of actual power without having those slaves remain technically owned by someone. Understanding began to dawn in Venya's mind, and with it came a flutter of something that might have been hope. You mean marriage? She whispered. I mean marriage, Ji-hoon confirmed, and specifically a marriage recognized by both human custom and hegemony law, which would make you a legal person under their own system and a citizen of Earth by extension. Venya felt the floor tilt beneath her, and she had to place a hand on the desk to steady herself. You would bind yourself to me, she said slowly, to a slave, to someone worth less than the furniture in this room, just to create a legal fiction. Ji-hoon turned his chair to face her fully, and his expression was serious but kind. First, he said, you are not worth less than anything, because worth is not something that can be measured by laws written by those who profit from cruelty. And second, yes, I would bind myself to you if you are willing, because it is the only way I can see to truly protect you. He leaned forward slightly, and Venya had to resist the instinct to flinch away from his closeness. But I will not do this without your consent, he added firmly. and I need you to understand exactly what I am proposing before you give me an answer." He explained it all to her then. The legal requirements and the potential risks, and the fact that while the marriage would need to appear genuine to satisfy hegemony scrutiny, he would never expect anything from her that she did not wish to give it, would be a partnership built on paper and necessity, not on any romantic feeling. And she would be free to live her own life once they reached human space. "Why?" Venya finally asked when he had finished speaking. "Why would you do this for me when you gain nothing and risk much?" Ji-hoon was quiet for a long moment. And when he spoke, his voice was soft. "Because where I come from," he said, "we believe that every thinking, feeling being is born free. And that belief is not just words we say, but something we are willing to sacrifice for." He looked at her with those strange round eyes that held no cruelty and no hidden malice. "I cannot change your entire galaxy," he admitted, "and I cannot free every slave in hegemony space. But I can change your life if you will let me. And sometimes that is how great changes begin. With one person standing up and saying that this particular injustice will not continue." Unchallenged, Venya felt tears sliding down her cheeks. And she did not try to stop them. In her entire life, no one had ever offered her a choice about anything that truly mattered. And now this strange human was offering her the greatest choice of all. "If I say no," she asked hesitantly, "what happens then?" "Then I keep looking for another way," Ji-hoon replied without hesitation. "Because my offer is not conditional on you accepting this particular plan. And I will find a way to help you regardless of your answer." She believed him. And that belief was perhaps the most terrifying thing of all because it meant lowering walls. She had built over decades of survival, but she was so tired of those walls. And so tired of being afraid, and so tired of belonging to others instead of herself. "Yes," Venya whispered. And the word felt like jumping off a cliff into unknown waters. Ji-hoon smiled, and it transformed his serious face into something warm and welcoming. "Then we have work to do," he said, "because we need to make this marriage so legally airtight that not even the High Merchant himself can challenge it." He stood and offered her his hand. Not to pull her up, but simply to help if she wished to take it. Venya looked at that hand for a long moment, then reached out and placed her fingers in his palm. His grip was gentle and warm, and he did not let go until she was steady on her feet. "Partners," he said quietly. "Partners," she repeated, and the word tasted like freedom. The banquet hall stretched wide beneath a ceiling of living crystal that pulsed with soft blue light. And Commander Seong Ji-hoon stood among creatures he had only read about in diplomatic briefings until 3 months ago. He adjusted his dress, uniform, and watched the Vorthani delegates move through the crowd like shadows wrapped in silk robes, their forearms gesturing in patterns that meant nothing to human eyes, but apparently conveyed great status among their kind. Humanity had only joined the galactic community 18 months prior, and every interaction still felt like walking through a minefield. While blindfolded, the Vorthani hegemony controlled 47 star systems and commanded one of the largest trade networks in the known galaxy. And Earth needed their cooperation if humans wanted access to the rare minerals required for faster-than-light travel. Ji-hoon was not a soldier despite his title, but rather a translator and cultural specialist assigned to make sure humanity did not accidentally start a war by using the wrong fork at dinner. He had studied the Vorthani for years, learned their language, memorized their customs, and prepared himself for anything. Or so he had believed. High Merchant Torvax approached him with all 4 arms spread wide in the gesture of generous greeting, and Ji-hoon returned the bow exactly as protocol demanded. "Human Commander," Torvax said in the rasping voice common to his species, "tonight we celebrate the trade agreement between our peoples, and I wish to honor you with a gift befitting this occasion." Ji-hoon felt the attention of the entire room shift toward them, and he understood that whatever happened next would be witnessed by every major power represented at the station. The hegemony is most generous, he replied carefully, and humanity is grateful for this partnership. Torvax made a clicking sound that passed for laughter among his kind and gestured toward a side entrance with his upper right arm. Bring forth the gift. He commanded. 2 Vorthani guards entered the hall, and between them walked a figure that made Ji-hoon's stomach drop into his boots. She was humanoid, but clearly not human. With skin the color of pale violet and hair like strands of woven silver that fell past her shoulders, her eyes were large and dark and utterly empty of hope. And around her throat she wore a collar of black metal that marked her status as clearly as any brand. She was a slave. Ji-hoon had read about the practice in his briefings, had known that the hegemony and several other galactic powers still engaged in the ownership of sentient beings. But reading about something and seeing it were two very different experiences. Woman kept her gaze fixed on the floor as the guards brought her to stand before him, and Ji-hoon noticed the faint scars on her wrists where restraints had worn away the skin over years of use. She is Ilari, Torvax explained with obvious pride in his gift. From the conquered territories, trained since birth in all manner of service. And I am told she is quite skilled at anticipating the needs of her master. The word hit Ji-hoon like a physical blow, and he had to force his expression to remain neutral, while every instinct screamed at him to refuse. But he was a diplomat, and he understood what refusal would mean. Vorthani had offered this gift in front of dozens of witnesses from a dozen different species, and to reject it would be seen as a grave insult that could destroy the trade agreement humanity desperately needed. More than that, if he refused, the woman would simply be given to someone else, or perhaps punished for failing to please the intended recipient. He had no good options, only varying degrees of bad ones. The hegemony honors me greatly, Ji-hoon heard himself say, and the words tasted like ash in his mouth. I accept this gift in the spirit of friendship between our peoples. Torvax clicked with satisfaction and waved his lower arms in dismissal. And just like that, the woman belonged to Ji-hoon. She followed him without being told, walking 3 steps behind as she had clearly been trained to do. And Ji-hoon could feel her fear radiating off her like heat from a fire. He did not speak as they made their way through the station corridors toward the human diplomatic quarters, partly because he did not trust himself to say anything coherent, and partly because he needed time to think. Door to his quarters slid open at his approach, and he stepped inside and waited for her to follow before commanding it to lock behind them. The woman immediately knelt on the floor with her head bowed, assuming a position of submission that had obviously been drilled into her through years of training and likely punishment. Ji-hoon stood there looking at her for a long moment, feeling sick and furious and helpless all at once. What is your name? He finally asked. She flinched at the question as though he had struck her, and when she spoke her voice was barely a whisper. This one is called Venya. Master, if it pleases you. It does not please me, Ji-hoon said, and she flinched again, clearly expecting punishment for her answer. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, reminding himself that none of this was her fault, and that his anger needed to be directed at the system that had created this horror rather than its victim. I need you to understand something, he said slowly, and I need you to really hear me, so please look at me when I speak. Venya raised her head with obvious reluctance, and Ji-hoon saw terror swimming in those large dark eyes. She expected cruelty because cruelty was all she had ever known, and whatever she had heard about humans had clearly not prepared her for anything different. In my culture, Ji-hoon continued, slavery is considered one of the greatest evils that exists, and it is something my people fought a terrible war to end many generations ago. Confusion flickered across her features, and Ji-hoon suspected no one had ever spoken to her about such things. I cannot own you, he said firmly. And I will not own you, because you are a person and not a thing. But I also cannot simply free you here, where they would just recapture you and perhaps punish you for my actions." Venya stared at him as though he had begun speaking a language she did not understand. "And perhaps in a way he had, so I need to think," Ji-hoon concluded. "And I need time to find a solution that will actually protect you, rather than just making me feel better about myself." He moved to the small sleeping area and began pulling blankets from the bed, tossing them onto the couch near the viewport. "You will sleep in the bed," he told her, "and I will sleep here. And tomorrow we will begin figuring out how to make you free in a way that actually means something." Venya did not move from her kneeling position, and Ji-hoon could see that she was trembling. "Master," she whispered. "This one does not understand what is happening." Ji-hoon felt his heart break a little at the fear and confusion in her voice, and he wished he could simply fix everything with a word or a gesture. But the galaxy did not work that way, and real change required more than good intentions. "What is happening?" he said gently. "Is that you have met a human, and we do things differently than the others you have known. And I promise you that I will never hurt you or allow anyone else to hurt you while you are under my protection." She searched his face for the lie she clearly expected to find there, and Ji-hoon let her look for as long as she needed. Finally, something in her expression shifted. Not quite trust, but perhaps the first tiny seed of hope that trust might someday be possible. It was a beginning, and for now, that would have to be enough.